In the last episode, I discussed the heavy lift helicopter program, but I didn't go into depth as to what it was or the requirements. The helicopter that came out of this program was gargantuan and was designed to hold a truly ridiculous amount of weight, 22.5 tons, or the weight of two M113 armoured personnel carriers. It should be noted that the Mi-26, the largest operational helicopter, has a carrying capacity of 20 tons. In the late 60s, the US military had been looking at the Soviet Mi-6, Mi-26, and the proposed Mi-12 super heavy lift helicopters that all had a carrying capacity that dwarfed the Chinook and the Sky Crane, and decided that that wasn't good enough. America needed a super heavy lift helicopter. In 1970, the Department of Defense issued a request for proposal for the heavy lift helicopter program. Proposals from 5 companies were submitted: Hughes Tool Corporation, Gyrodyne of America, the Cayman Corporation, Sikorsky, and Vertol Boeing. This is where I have to be honest. I found some limitations of researching this era of prototype helicopters. I found somewhat well-known helicopters like the Hughes XCH-62, which I will be doing a video on, and a bunch of extremely large helicopters being developed by a bunch of different manufacturers. They range from anywhere from the 1960s right up to the late 1970s, and I don't really know why. I'm going to include what I think were the 5 proposals, but just take this information with a grain of salt. Let's start with Hughes, who submitted this thing, a 270 pound or 122,000 kilogram or 135 ton behemoth that would have been capable of carrying a 60 ton payload, roughly the weight of a main battle tank, 100 nautical miles. The main thrust of the craft would have come from tip jets and 4 gas turbine engines. The helicopter would have had a rotor diameter of 185 feet. There are advantages of using a tip jet powered design. With conventional helicopters, the heavier the payload the craft is designed to carry, the heavier and more complex the gearbox and rotor assembly has to be to support the weight. For example, the gearbox and rotor of the Mi-6 weighs 3,200 kilograms, which is more than the weight of the 2 turbine engines it uses. Gearboxes are also far more complex than ducting hot gas to the rotor tips. You could even theoretically just stick an entire gas turbine engine on the tip of the rotor. Of course, this adds problems like increasing drag in the event of auto rotation, but this can be minimized. In a future video, I'm going to talk about the Hughes XCH-62 and discuss some other crazy tip jet powered designs. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information about Gyrodyne's submission. And unfortunately, it's the same story as Cayman. Although I will be doing a video about Cayman in the future, as they have developed some wacky helicopters. Sikorsky submitted this design, which looks like an enlarged S-64. It had a rotor diameter of 124 feet and a tail rotor diameter of 26 feet. Just for context, an R-44 has a rotor diameter of 33 feet. It would have been powered by 3 7,000 horsepower engines. Its rotor head system was also very simplified with only 80 parts. Sikorsky also stressed that the design was within technology limits at the time. It also had the ability to carry 12 troops in a cabin behind the cockpit. It's a rather safe design, but I imagine they would have run into problems designing a gearbox assembly strong enough to lift the required weight. The ultimate winner of the program was the Boeing Vertol submission. Their submission, the XCH-62, was in a more advanced state of assembly than Sikorsky's submission. It was a tandem rotor design, similar to the Chinook, with 3 8,000 shaft horsepower engines. This would have allowed the design to carry 20 tons of payload. There was also space behind the cockpit for 12 troops, with the aft section of the fuselage containing the gearboxes and engines. The stub wings contained the fuel tanks and also supported the gigantic tricycle landing gear. Unfortunately, the nearly 24,000 combined horsepower proved way too much for the gearbox. One report of the XCH-62 stated that the transmission combiner drivetrain, at least in the respect of torque, would double existing limits of contemporary designs. Boeing reported that the program was nearly 90% complete, with the company planning to test fly the design the following year. But unfortunately, the military cut funding for the program. But why had they done this? Boeing had developed advanced lubrication, oil cooling, and hardened steel gears that had resulted in a drivetrain that satisfied the HLH program. Even the aft rotor was successfully tested at full design speed and torque. There was even a second prototype in the works, with lower ground clearance and a lower overall height so the helicopter could fit in hangars. The XCH-62 was the first helicopter to feature a full, fly-by-wire system and automatic flight control systems. These flight control systems would feature autopilot capabilities and ease pilot requirements, including automatic load stabilization, which would dampen the tendency of sling-loaded cargo to swing in a hover. The XCH-62 was actually the first helicopter design to be designed around the fly-by-wire concept. Ultimately, with a tightening budget in the military and rising costs of the program thanks to delays and the advanced nature of the program, the Army decided to cancel the program. The XCH-62 had produced significant results. It had pioneered fly-by-wire controls in helicopters, developed an increased durability gearbox, and had used form honeycomb panels in its construction, reducing assembly time and providing a higher strength to weight ratio compared to conventional web and cord construction. I have information I've written about the high costs associated with super heavy lift programs on my Patreon for those interested. There were attempts by DARPA and NASA to secure funding in 1989 to complete the prototype and perform experimental flights for the pair, but Congress shut down the idea of allocating a further $71 million to the program. The only prototype was shipped from its warehouse in Philadelphia to Panama City, Florida, where it was airlifted by a Chinook to a museum in Fort Rucker, Alabama, where it sat for 18 years before being scrapped, much to the dismay of many online who called it a great loss. But as the Army Museum director, Steve Maxim, said, it was never an aircraft, it never flew, it was essentially an incomplete concept, the shell of an idea. It was never structurally completed, it was never mechanically completed, it was never electronically harnessed. There was only one rotor head produced, the second was not. There were only blades made for one head. There was no drivetrain components, the upper structures, both fore and aft, were never manufactured. The interior was never completed. In no way, shape or form did it qualify as an aircraft, historic or otherwise. Ultimately, the museum decided it was more worth its time to maintain actual aircraft in the museum, rather than this oddity. The only prototype had severely deteriorated due to being kept outdoors, and it was considered a risk to even attempt to move it. So in this case, I understand why it was destroyed. The landing gear, however, was saved and sent to the UK to be displayed in the Helicopter Museum. So a part of this true behemoth still exists in the world. I do find it strange how the US military allowed the program to continue for so long and get so close to finishing before cancelling it, but I guess we'll never know. Ultimately, it's not hard to see why the program was cancelled. Heavy lift is already a niche role helicopters are designed to fill, and super heavy lift is even more niche than that. So why develop a cutting-edge helicopter to simply fill such an incredibly niche role? And to be honest, I think it's just a case of one-upsmanship on America's part. They wouldn't allow the Soviet Union to be the kings of super heavy lift helicopters, so they wanted a piece of the pie. But once they realized that they really didn't have a need for the helicopter, they cancelled it. The Mi-6 exists because Russia did have a need to transport large pieces of equipment and infrastructure across the vast Russian taiga, which in some cases is impassable to vehicles on the ground. But America doesn't have that problem. I think the US military just realized that their existing fleet of Chinooks, CH-53s and CH-54s was sufficient to meet their needs. I'm not too sad the program was cancelled, but it is a shame we never got to see this bird take to the sky under its own power. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.